Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Terry Gerton, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration, and I want to welcome you all to another discussion about the election workforce. This webinar is the second in a series of events planned this year by the Academy's Elections Working Group, each of which will address important election workforce issues. One of the Academy's grand challenges is to protect electoral integrity and enhance voter participation. And it really couldn't be more timely, as even this morning, there's another round of headlines from political candidates who won't promise to accept the results of the 2024 election. Today's event will examine the responsibilities of local poll workers and the growing number of challenges they face. These individuals are at the center of the election process, and they're essential for maintaining the secure and nonpartisan administration of elections. So we hope that this event will not only give you more insight into this crucial role, but perhaps inspire you to serve as a poll worker. In fact, conversations with this group inspired me to volunteer as a poll worker a couple of years ago. I really wanted to understand for myself exactly what goes on behind the scenes so that I could speak not just with conviction, but really from experience about the trustworthiness of our system of elections. In the process, I've received excellent training. I've been able to set up and take down the election equipment. I've signed as to the accuracy of election results, and I've been a little part of democracy in action. But I've also become aware that not every poll worker shares my positive experiences. Some perform this vital work without the resources my county has, and in the face of real personal threats. So today we want to explore the world of local poll workers, both the professionals and the volunteers, with an outstanding panel of experts. So to get us started, I would like to introduce you to the working group chair, Nancy Tate. Since 2015, Nancy has served as the co-chair of the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, which is an information sharing collaborative focused on commemorating the 100th anniversary of women winning the constitutional right to vote. Before that, she served as the executive director of the League of Women Voters of the United States, a national nonpartisan organization engaged in education and advocacy for voters. So Nancy, thanks for getting us started on this journey, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Terry. And I'm certainly so happy to hear about your experiences as a poll worker. That's been a great side benefit of this, our working group's job. The purpose of the Academy's Election Working Group is to gather and share information about the complexities of election administration, especially about the election workforce, the thousands of individuals around the country whom we all rely on to make democracy work. Elections occur continuously in the U.S., and the specifics of election administration vary considerably across the country. But the core management issue is the same everywhere: having the right number of competent election workers, both full-time and part-time, who can execute the laws in a nonpartisan manner. In recent elections, we've seen the growing number of challenges that this workforce has to face. And we've seen that when voters lose confidence in these workers and their ability to execute elections in a fair and nonpartisan manner, then voters can lose confidence in the election results. Yet most Americans know almost nothing about how elections actually work at the local level. And our working group has been hosting a series of webinars on this topic and will continue to do so throughout 2024. But today, as Terry said, we're going to focus on the workers that we actually see at the polls, those fellow community members who volunteer their time to serve as poll workers. We're going to begin with Dr. Bridgett King, who will provide an overview of this workforce and also cover some of the differences and similarities across the country. She will be followed by a great panel, including two poll workers, one who has served in this capacity for a number of years, and another who served while she was in college. And they're joined by a local elections official whose job it is to recruit and train hundreds of poll workers almost every year. And the conversation will be moderated by Tom Hicks, a commissioner of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Tom has served in a variety of roles at the commission, including being the chair, over the last 10 years. He's had extensive election experience before that, including time as the election counsel at the U.S. House of Representatives. So Tom, I'm happy to turn over this really interesting conversation to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nancy. And I echo your sentiments to thank Terry for her service as a poll worker. And I think that that's great. And hopefully we'll get a few more folks to serve as poll workers after this webinar. Our first presenter is Dr. Bridgett King. Dr. King is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kentucky. Currently, overarching themes in her scholarship include the administration's structure of felony disenfranchisement and its effects on participation and representation, citizens' confidence in the electoral outcomes, and the consequences of administrative discretion on voter experiences and democratic representation. She also works on interdisciplinary projects that apply systems and architectural engineering approaches to the field of elections administration to address challenges associated with administrative decision-making and voter experiences. As an extension of this work, she has an expanded research agenda that considers how citizens engage in the democratic process in Liberia. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. King for a few slides and remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Okay, so I just want to provide some remarks to provide a little context around who our poll workers are, what they do, and how our federalist structure shapes their work, but also how they are recruited and trained. So let's see. Okay, assuming this is working. Okay. So in federal, state, and local elections across the United States, poll workers play a pivotal role in elections and democracy. Poll workers, as some of the previous speakers have noted, are your friends, your family, your neighbors, your colleagues, and members of your community. They are citizen volunteers who take time out of their schedule to complete the required training and serve in polling locations, often during both the early voting period and on election day. Poll workers are the frontline workers who are on site in polling locations where they interact with voters, check them in, verify their eligibility to vote, answer questions, assist with voting machines, and troubleshoot, and resolve problems as they arrive. Poll workers are also responsible for setting up polling locations, following a detailed process for the opening and closing of the polls, and in many instances, ensuring that the polling location's voting records are secured for tabulation. During any given election, state and local election officials work to ensure that polling locations are adequately staffed with qualified and highly trained poll workers. And as you can see from the slide, in the 2020 election, there were approximately 775,101 poll workers distributed across polling locations in the United States. Given this high number, ensuring that polling locations are managed by an adequate number of highly trained temporary staff is critical to ensure that eligible voters who choose to cast a ballot in person can do so with confidence in the election process and the results. And so while I'm using the term poll workers, and that is in the title of this particular webinar, there are also other terms that are used to describe poll workers. They may be called election judges, booth workers, wardens, commissioners, election inspectors, or election workers. In addition to the responsibilities that poll workers fulfill, poll workers also shape how voters evaluate their in-person voting experience, as well as the experiences that are far removed from their personal interaction on election day. So interactions with poll workers shape how they view and have confidence in elections and the outcomes, not only across their county, but across their state and across the nation. So we know that in addition to ensuring that they are there to fulfill those in-person activities that I mentioned on the previous slide, poll workers and citizen interactions with them shape voter experience, explicitly their confidence, the quality of polling locations, how well they're being run, also impacts, citizen confidence. And we also know that in instances where voters see themselves in poll workers, and while the research quoted is specifically focused on race, we could also think about how individuals who are disabled or who speak another language also might have increased confidence when they see themselves among the body of individuals who serves the polls on election days. Across the 50 states, there are a variety of statutes that regulate the requirements to serve as a poll worker, and also the restrictions. They also establish poll worker eligibility, what compensation looks like, the work hours for poll workers, and the necessary and required training. In the United States, most states and territories require that a poll worker be a qualified registered voter. There are also residency requirements, which often limit where a poll worker can serve. Generally, poll workers serve, or the preference is that they serve in the precinct where they are districted to, or where they would geographically vote. But when this is not feasible, the local election authority may select poll workers from across the city or county or district, and in some instances across the state, depending on what state statute allows. Now, when we think about sort of the composition of poll workers, there are a variety of sources that we can use to learn about this population of individuals. One of the first sources I'm going to talk about is the United States Election Assistance Commission, Election Administration and Voting Survey. So from the eaves, what you see on the screen is the distribution of poll workers based on age from the 2018 midterm election all the way up to the 22 midterm election. And so what we see is that the distribution of poll workers, specifically relative to age, tends to skew towards older citizens and voters. We can also consider a recent survey conducted by Drs. Barry Burden and Robert Stein that covered 19 jurisdictions in 10 different states. And what they find in their survey of poll workers who worked prior to the November 2022 midterm election is that among individuals who have served, women outnumber men 2-to-1. The median age was 64. About 1 in 10 of the poll workers were brand new, but there were also 1 in 10 who had served for over a decade. And perhaps most promisingly, they noted that 4 out of 5 poll workers reported that they had intentions to serve in the future. Of those who indicated that they would not serve, the primary reason was that they were too busy. And while those are not factors that are in the control of election officials, the next 2 common options for not serving were a desire to work a shorter or different shift, or concerns about conflict at the polls. The survey also showed that long lines and voters having difficulty using machines were more prevalent than outright conflict and were more likely to deter people from serving again in 2022. In terms of why people serve, they found that the most prominent reasons were a sense of civic duty and a commitment to the election process as the primary motivating factors. Lastly, using the survey of the performance of American elections, we can also approximate the racial composition of poll workers across the United States. In the survey, which I provided for you here for 2016, 2020, and 22, voters are asked about the race of the poll worker who checked them in. And although poll workers are overwhelmingly white, in many ways, the racial composition of poll workers across the United States does reflect the racial composition of voters. Now, while most poll workers obviously have to be registered, and you need to be 18 to be registered to vote, there is an exception. And that exception is in states that have youth poll worker programs that allow young voters or people under the age of 18 to serve. So what you see here is a map from a forthcoming report that presents the age requirements for serving as a poll worker. And so as you can see, there are considerable opportunities for those under the age of 18. However, if we look at the next map, you can also see that across many of these states that allow individuals under the age of 18, there are seemingly, to serve as poll workers, there are seemingly untapped opportunities to engage the youth as poll workers, as no state has a composition of poll workers that is over 10%, with California being at the highest. And so if we think about some of the benefits of young people serving, on the screen, I have for you some work that was conducted in 2020 of youth poll workers in Minneapolis. And what we find is that there are immense benefits for young people serving as poll workers, including, helping their community, but also them learning practical skills and improving their communication and creating a stronger sense of community. Across the states, there are also variations with respect to whether poll worker training is required for individuals or if it's just recommended under certain circumstances. And so again, here you can see there is extensive variation for the requirements of poll worker training prior to an individual serving at the polls. Going back to the eaves, we can also consider how easy or difficult it is across the states to recruit an adequate number of poll workers. And while there are many factors that may contribute to the challenges to recruitment and retention, rules that determine who can serve and where they serve, as well as qualifications for bipartisan teams, can also make it challenging to recruit poll workers and meet the balance of poll workers that is often required by state statute. And lastly, I'll begin my concluding remarks here. Although the requirements may vary, many states have made it very easy to sign up to become a poll worker. 25 states and DC offer online portals to submit a poll worker application to volunteer to serve as a poll worker. And where there are no state portals, local jurisdictions often have online portals that individuals can access. I'll also say, beyond serving as an individual, serving as a poll worker with a group can create an opportunity to give back to your community. Many jurisdictions allow for a collaborative adopt a precinct model, where a group basically adopts a precinct, and those individuals in turn are responsible for finding an adequate number of poll workers and ensuring they participate in whatever required training is necessary. But then instead of providing each individual with their compensation for serving as a poll worker, the group receives a check that they could then use to fundraise for an organization that supports a community or to provide for a specific charity. So in that way, serving as a poll worker can extend the reach of community organizations, for example, professional associations, civic agencies, faith-based organizations, sororities and fraternities, affinity and identity-based organizations such as things like high school sports teams and clubs, also college clubs, political parties who often play an important role in recruiting poll workers, and as the example on the screen suggests, also sports teams. And so if we think about sort of why someone should become a poll worker, one, your community needs you. As we go back to the second slide, local jurisdictions have to recruit a lot of poll workers, both during the early voting period and on election day. Serving as a poll worker is an opportunity to protect and promote U.S. democracy. You will learn about the voting process, both inside and out. You will get to work with your neighbors and meet people. And although perhaps not the greatest motivating factor, poll workers are financially compensated for their work. Thank you for your time. And with that, I will turn things back over to Commissioner Hicks.
Thank you, Dr. King. With that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel that will be talking about serving as poll workers and their experiences overall. So panelist Laura Schanberg is a professor of pediatric rheumatology at Duke University of Medicine, an active clinical researcher who has lived and voted in Durham, North Carolina for all her life. She was active as a poll observer for many years and now has served as a poll worker and judge since 2016. Richard Thompson II is a certified election registration administrator, CERTA, began working with the DC Board of Elections in 2018 and currently serves as the program manager for the Election Worker Division. Mr. Thompson is responsible for developing, implementing, and coordinating the training and recruitment of election workers for the District of Columbia. In this capacity, he has successfully developed an election worker training manual, an online training manual, and an in-person hands-on preparation for workers. These trainings complements are monumental in highlighting the goals and objectives associated with ensuring election workers' readiness for vote center operations. He's responsible for the placement and staffing of all early and election day vote centers. Mr. Thompson has worked to ensure, excuse me, Mr. Thompson has worked to ensure that the techniques incorporated into the District of Columbia's training program are substantive, user-friendly, and functional. Mr. Thompson received his BA in Business Administration from Clark Atlanta University. And last but not least, Leah DeYoung is a 2023 graduate of the University of Michigan. Having earned BAs in Political Science and Psychology, Leah was also a member of the university's Top Voter Engagement Association organization, Turn Up, Turn Out, for 4 years. Leah has served as an election worker, totaling 7 elections in the Metro Detroit area. Currently, she works as an election specialist with the Illinois State Board of Elections. And with that, we'll just jump right into questions, so if folks can turn their cameras on. How have you interacted with the elections process for those of you who've served as poll workers? And what sort of challenges did you face in those roles? Anyone can jump in.
So I'm happy to jump in. I've been involved with all the different aspects of what goes on at the polling place during elections and during early voting, including setting up, taking down, signing off on the tabulator, training people who are new, figuring out whether somebody's eligible in the particular area and where else they should go vote if this is the wrong spot. Pretty much all the parts of it that Terry mentioned at the beginning. And I think that the hardest thing that has come up during the time, and I've been doing this part since 2016, is that at least in North Carolina, the guidelines, the rules, whatever, keep changing. The laws change, sometimes more than once a year. And I've been involved both with primaries and with the general election. And that gets confusing and stressful for poll workers for the changes to be happening so often. And then also adds to the stress of voters coming in, and they don't know that the rules have been changed. And so they may be angry because they can no longer vote where they voted for 15 years or whatever, because the districts have changed. And so a lot of the uncertainty and changes, I think, really amp up the difficulties for the poll workers and also for the voters.
I would echo what Laura said about the work that I've done in elections. I have served as a chairperson in Michigan for 2 different elections. So that kind of takes on a bigger role of more of a supervisory position over all of the other election workers. A lot of what you mentioned, Laura, about, training new people. And I would say that something else that is a pretty big challenge, at least for where I was working, was finding people to be election workers in the first place, which obviously isn't the role of the election workers themselves, but does have an impact when it comes to election day and you're working with less people than is ideal. So trying to stretch people's duties out more thinly than they would be if the polling place was properly staffed, or being called. I've been called several times to work a different polling place than the day that I started, because people have gotten sick or dropped out or had to go home for some reason. So that kind of shuffling of election workers and just the uncertainty of, how much you're going to be able to do and how much responsibility you'll have in the day is one of the challenges for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. So for Laura and Leah, what made you decide to be a poll worker? And Laura, I know that you've been doing this since 2016. And basically, why have you continued doing it?
So prior to 2016, I had worked probably for 10 years or so as an observer, and was increasingly, I don't know, dissatisfied with that position, doing that. I didn't feel like I was really having much impact on helping people to vote or the outcomes of the elections. Not that being a poll worker, you impact the outcomes of the elections, but at least you actually get to help people really vote. And so having been involved with elections on in different kinds of ways since I was a teenager, I thought I'd tried this, and I have to say that I found it extremely satisfying working as a poll worker. I enjoy the people that I meet, both the people coming in to vote and the folks that you work with, because they're not folks that you run into in your normal life mostly. And it's sort of self-sustaining because I enjoy it. So I continue to do it, and have continued to take on more responsibility, and have no intention of not doing it at this point. I'm committed for quite a while.
That is great to hear. Well, Leah?
Yeah, I decided to be a poll worker when I was a student, because I was really interested in politics. I already kind of had the drive and the passion, but didn't really want to put that toward a campaign or, something inherently partisan or super political. So I thought that election work was a really good way to stay involved in civic engagement, and, step into politics without having to pick a side necessarily, and get a deeper understanding of what goes on with elections without, campaigning or having to go door to door or anything like that.
So
I would add that it is extremely interesting to learn actually how elections really work. And even if you've been engaged with voting for a long time and did have civics back when I went to school, they had civics, which they don't seem to have now, which I think is a big problem. But that's a different thing. But you learn an awful lot about exactly how the voting machines work and exactly what happens, which is interesting for sure.
well, going on that, and so you think that they should teach civics again? Do you think there are any other suggestions that you think can be done differently in terms of, or for the recruitment of poll workers?
For the recruitment of poll workers?
Yep.
So where I live, the recruitment isn't actually that big a problem. But I think that if students learn more about like civics, for example, that it's likely to make them be more interested in how the system and stuff really works. I also think it's an enormous problem how little people understand about even the basics. Like people come in to vote and they don't really understand what a primary is, and get mad because they can't vote for every candidate that they want and think they should have access to more than one ballot, and they don't understand about voting in your district, and they don't understand, lots of different things like that raise the tension often in the voting area, because people are convinced that they're right, of course, and then when they start getting whatever, then other people in the other voters also may. So I think that the lack of knowledge on the part of the voters is actually a huge problem for the voting system. I also think that contributes to people not trusting the elections because they don't really understand how they work anyway. So anyway, yeah.
I think that's really helpful. Is there anything that either of you would say or what would you say to others to encourage them to become poll workers?
I would
And are there ways that citizens can help and support poll workers? You know, I think that's a two-part question, but I think that they go together.
I would definitely say to people who are engaged with the process just through voting, it's really amazing how much more of a insight it gives you into the process of voting when you actually become a poll worker. Because just going through once and doing it yourself really isn't enough to grasp, you know, how everything works together, how every little piece of what you're doing, the forms that you're filling out lead to these grand vote totals at the end of an election. And so if people are feeling like the process is daunting, if they think that it's really overcomplicated and hard to understand and very opaque, becoming a poll worker can really help with that, and to see, you know, how everything works and how everything gets counted. And I think that citizens who aren't poll workers can help by asking questions. If you come into the precinct and you don't know what's going on, or you have a question about why somebody's doing something, just ask. And then the poll workers will let you know exactly what happens, so that you can be a more informed voter, and help to combat misinformation if you do hear it around after election day.
I think that's really, really helpful.
They can also check where they're supposed to vote before they come, and that, which will solve a lot of angst for both the voter and the poll workers. One of the things that we haven't brought up, but I just would like to mention, is that I have been so impressed with all the poll workers that I've worked with, and how much they're invested in individual people being able to vote, even if they know that they're voting against their own personal opinions. And I have never, in my years of doing this, and I've been in situations where I was representing the minority party. I've been in situations where I've been representing the majority party for that particular polling section and area. And I have never seen anybody, try to keep somebody from voting, or not just really do their damnness to make sure that a given person is able to vote for whoever it is that they want to vote for.
I think that's incredible, and thank you, Laura. So one of the things I wanted to thank you for is also serving as a poll watcher and observer. So someone who would come in and just observe, but not interfere with the election overall. But and we've seen a lot of people do that in the last 4 years or so, and they've come in with questions. As both of you have said, those questions should be answered, so that they can get a better understanding. But I would call on those folks, once they get those questions answered, to serve as a poll worker moving forward. So they can actually see the process from the inside. And you had brought up something about making a plan for election day. And this is where I would highlight that the EAC on our webpage has a Elections 101 part. So eac.gov, where basically making a plan for the election, whether or not you vote in person or vote using the mail, to make sure that you have a plan before you go to the polls or cast your ballot. So we don't want to leave Richard out. So, we understand that the DC Board of Elections is known to have a good poll worker training program. And can you describe that to us briefly?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so the DC Board of Elections, we have a required training for all election workers, and it is a 4-hour training that provides information for election workers to be successful during early voting and on election day. Generally, our training classes are taught by 2 to 3 trainers, and class size is anywhere maybe from 20 to 30 participants. When an election worker attends one of our training classes, they are given a training manual that's been specifically designed for that particular election. And in that particular training class, well, let me back up. In every training class, we train by position. So we have 3 different positions that we train for: registration clerk, a ballot clerk, or a voter assistance clerk. So each class is designed for that specific position. And in the training class, we would have a PowerPoint presentation that the instructors would teach by. We also do hands-on interaction with all of our voting equipment, and we do role-playing components in all of our classes as well. We've also developed within the last 2 years an online training module that covers step-by-step instructions, duties and responsibilities, and expectations for election workers. Our goal with the online training was to reduce the in-person training class from 4 hours down to about a 30-minute, if you will, virtual training with a series of videos that highlights the most important aspects of each position. And at the end of the training modules, there is a knowledge check that all participants must complete to ensure that they understand and can effectively apply the content that they've learned in the training. They can access it from their smartphones, they can access it from tablets or from their laptops. And during the last election, many of them actually used their smartphones or their tablets while they were in the vote centers when there was a little downtime if they needed some additional training one-on-one.
How are you recruiting poll workers? And is it difficult to recruit the number of poll workers needed for years, like election years being presidential or off-year elections?
So we have a voter education and outreach division that organizes voter registration drives and encourages residents to become election workers at various outreach events. Our voter education and outreach division, they collaborate with civic organizations who partner with us to do, as Ms. Dr. King mentioned, adopt a vote centers for election days. So they may be sororities or fraternities. This particular year, we've had some students from Howard University, pharmaceutical departments, other colleges, universities. There'll be a group of people that will come together that will want to adopt a vote center. So we also use social media platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, where we can inform election workers or inform residents how they can become election workers. And then we also have a large database of election workers that we've used year after year, or that have volunteered with us year after year in each election cycle. And many of them come back year after year as well. The age span of those election workers, we also recruit and do some attend high school. So we have a lot of high school students that want to volunteer with us, sometimes just for community service. Sometimes they want the stipend as well. But our election workers span anywhere from high school students to college students to even senior citizens, sometimes in their 70s or 80s. And we've in fact had some election workers that have worked with us for at least 25 plus years. So it's a wide gamut.
So that definitely answers my question of how, do you have any long time election poll workers? And
Yes,
so
we do.
25 years is definitely a long time. Leah, how were you recruited? Did the University of Michigan do this, the local election office? And I personally know Jackie, who runs the Ann Arbor polling places, basically. So did she do this, or were you recruited another way?
So I was actually recruited in high school. I started working when I was 17 at the polls. So our local clerk, our township clerk in West Bloomfield, came to our high school and gave a presentation on elections in general and becoming an election worker. And I thought that was really interesting and it sounded like a great opportunity, a nice way to skip class for a day. So that was how I started to get involved.
Do you think that having election day holidays at college campuses can encourage some sort of engagement to have more students serve as poll workers?
Definitely. That was one of the initiatives that our civic organization group Turn Up Turnout was working on. But at the time that I left at the University of Michigan, and I know that they're still trucking away, trying to get that on the calendars as a holiday. But I think that definitely that would help. Students are already burdened with so many different activities. They have not only classes, but clubs. Some of them work part-time jobs. And if you can alleviate one burden from them and free up a little bit of time to be able to go to the polls, that would be really helpful. If kids are able to see on their syllabus, oh, why don't we have class this day? Oh, right, it's election day. That kind of reminder every single time they look back at the syllabus, or every time they think about next week in November, would be really helpful to start getting those wheels turning, getting people into gear to vote, to register, and eventually turn out.
So I was actually in Chicago last week, and so I'm sorry that I missed you at the Illinois State Board of Elections. But have you gained any sort of insight from your role at the Illinois State Board of Elections?
Definitely. It's a whole different ballgame working the other side of elections. And it has shown me a lot about how big of a team it takes to make elections work. Being a poll worker is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, even though it is a really big job to making sure that the day goes smoothly. It takes months and months of work behind the scenes for city, county, and state level officials to make a cohesive election and make sure that everyone is able to vote on election day. And so that big process has kind of revealed itself to me, and I have become a lot more knowledgeable about how we eventually get to the place that we even need poll workers in the first place to have everyone be able to vote.
Great. Laura, if you want to jump in with anything, just let us know. You know, I do have one more for Richard, and that's, Laura, do you want to say something?
No, I'm interested listening to Leah and trying to figure out how I could get an opportunity on the other side. What's going on?
Richard, what steps do you and your team take to build voter trust for participation?
To build voter trust. Well, we're always planning for the next election, and we try to educate our election workers when they come to training about the voting process, about how our equipment works. And we try to educate them and hope that they'll go out into the community and educate others. That will build trust within their own community, with their own families as well. And we have voter registration drives where we actually take our equipment out into the community, and we show election workers as well as other DC residents the equipment that we use doing voting, and allow them to actually do test votes on the equipment, which is the same thing we do when we go to high schools or to colleges as well, and just other civic organizations.
That's great. That is really, really great. If Dr. King is still with us, I do have one or two questions for her. So in your research, do you, and from some of the experience shared here today, do you think that there's a nationwide data that's been, that's how to explain it. So with the experiences shared today, do they reflect national data that you've seen in your research?
I mean, so the one thing I will say is if we think about sort of all the things that go into elections, we don't know very much about sort of poll workers and what their experiences are like. Like the panelists, I have spent many an election day sitting in a polling location as an observer for research purposes. So generally, I would say, yes, you have voters coming in very confused. I remember being in LA County where every time there was a first-time voter in one of the polling locations, there was like a bit of a celebration. So sort of what that experience is like varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think that's just sort of the nature of our federalist system, where voters are very different and their needs are very different. And the work that Rich and other local election officials do is important in ensuring that polling workers are staffed with well-trained individuals who are capable of meeting those needs, and ensuring that eligible voters are able to cast a ballot when voting in person on election day. That's my non-answer answer to your question.
Oh, thank you. That reminds me of when I was in observing or seeing an election office in Cincinnati, Ohio. They have a fire bell that they ring whenever a new voter comes in to basically acknowledge that this is the first time they voted and give them a little encouragement to continue on doing that. Before I turn it over to get more questions from the audience, I would like to ask all of you, what can the public do to support poll workers and election offices? And I know that Laura, you had talked a little bit more about what voters should do before they get to the polls as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the education piece, I think, is big. Also, don't come at the last minute because whatever, if there's a problem, it's going to happen at the last minute. And then, if you don't have time to go someplace else, if you're in the wrong place, or if there's something else going on. So I would strongly encourage people to not wait till the last minute. And to remember when they come in that there may be a wait, and not to be aggravated about that. Actually, where I am, the waits are usually very short, and people get very annoyed if they're, have to wait for 5 minutes or something. But I think, come in not all tense, and be ready to ask questions like Leah suggested, and sort of feel community. Voting is a community thing to do. And I think some folks come in and you can see how much they enjoy it. And that's great for all the people around them and for poll workers also.
So before the other folks answer, what I'm hearing from you is that if there's early voting in the area, that the voters should come in early, because waiting to the very last minute on a very long day can be very stressful for the poll workers themselves, and come in prepared, basically. So.
And in a good mood.
And in a good mood. Smiles always help.
Yes.
Richard, you were going to say something?
I was going to say, here in the District of Columbia, we send out a voter guide to all of our voters, which lists all of our vote centers, the hours of operation, when they're open. Sometimes we have to move locations. It gives you all the information about early voting, information about how you can mail your ballot back in. So if they just take the time sometimes just to read the information, and pay attention to campaign materials that actually come to your home, or that you receive in the mail or via email or via phone call or text message as well, and do your due diligence about finding out which candidate you really want to vote for prior to walking directly into the polling place. May be helpful as well. And I also share with Laura, don't wait until election day. We generally have early voting for up to 7 days prior to election day, and you can certainly vote by mail in the District of Columbia. So don't wait for the last minute to make your final decision.
And if you come on election day, at least in North Carolina, the polls are open till 7:30. Don't come after 7 o'clock. Come before.
One other thing I would add, kind of after election day, before election day, is make sure that you are looking out for misinformation and disinformation surrounding elections. There's a lot of that floating out there on the internet, and it's really easy to see a attention-grabbing headline and believe what you see right away. But I would really encourage people to click that headline, read the whole article, try to find out what's going on with elections. If you think that something is wrong, if you think that something is misleading, take the time to actually dig deeper into it. Call up your local election officials, call up a state board of elections, and just ask what's going on, ask those questions that you have, make sure that the process is transparent for you, and try to be someone who combats misinformation and not plays into it or adds to it.
I think that would be very, very helpful. A few questions that we've received from the audience kind of ties into this a little bit in terms of Terry actually mentioned that there are some high visible and influential leaders who claim they may not accept the results of the election. Has these efforts cast doubt in the process of influencing the otherwise strong morale of poll workers in recent years? And Dr. King, I would say, anecdotally, do you have any sort of research on poll worker morale in the last few years? And, when they get misinformation, is this driving people away, or is this actually driving people to the polls to serve as poll workers? That strong sort of thought, after 9/11, there was a rush of people joining the military for that thought of saving the nation. So is there the same sort of feelings towards this?
I'll go first. So sort of two questions. I'll answer the second one first. So I think if we think back to COVID, right, there were strong pushes from local jurisdictions and across states for people who might not have otherwise considered serving as poll workers to do so, in part because we know the poll worker force tends to trend older, and for obvious reasons, those individuals obviously were more susceptible in many ways to COVID. But we also know in 2022 that sort of the demographic composition shifted back to being more heavily staffed by older individuals. So my answer is yes and no. I'm sure there are people who served during COVID who will continue to do so. But in whole, if we just specifically look at age, it would suggest no. On the matter of sort of how the public or poll workers specifically use information from political elites to make decisions about their willingness to serve as as poll workers. I haven't seen information specifically about poll workers, but there is research about sort of the general public and how they understand information about elections. And what it fundamentally suggests is that when there is a salient or important issue, and the public doesn't necessarily understand it, they use information or cues from partisan elites to interpret fact from fiction, right? So if you have one party that is continually saying, don't trust the processes, et cetera, and you have another that's saying, actually, everything is fine, and our elections are secure, go vote and participate, those are the lenses through which the public generally interprets what's happening around them. So if you wanted to sort of get a sense of how people are being impacted, you can sort of think about sort of how partisans are communicating about these issues, not only just nationally, but also across states and also within states and across local jurisdictions.
If anyone else wanted to jump in with that, more than welcome, or I can move to the next question. It's a question basically, I'm curious about the relationship between people's knowledge of how elections are conducted and their susceptibility to mis and disinformation about elections. This person's conducted some research in this, has been a poll worker once or twice, and was curious how the panel members feels about this issue. I think that goes back to what Dr. King just said before. So
Okay, I would kind of lean into what I just said about how how the public understands sort of what's happening around them when there are clear partisan divisions between how partisan elites are talking about sort of elections, but you also filter it out to other issues. The other thing I'll say is there is some research that suggests that when people are committed to a specific message, if it's false, even when you provide them with accurate information, it doesn't necessarily change their belief or commitment to the false information that they have already accepted or adopted as part of their reality of how they understand what's happening in the world around them.
So basically, they've already made their decision and they're just looking for backup to justify that decision.
So Bridgett, that would seem to me that what you're saying is we need to teach people young about this stuff
Yeah, I mean,
before they
yes.
become a part of it.
Yeah, and so like I'm a political scientist, and so most of my students are political science students, and so one might inherently think that like they have sort of a better grasp of how these institutions and processes work, and they don't necessarily. And I think those of us who, spend a lot of time in this space often forget how, as Leah mentioned, college students in particular, but also people 18 to 24 generally, who might be first-time voters, have a lot going on in their lives, right? And thinking about how to, one, navigate the processes, gather the correct information, all of that is very challenging. So yes, more civics for everyone. But I also think, even this semester, I've been astonished by the things that my students have told me that they thought were true about elections, and I'm not really sure where a lot of it comes from. One example being that, like, if during any given election you don't make a selection for a specific race or candidate or issue, your ballot is automatically voided. I don't know where that comes from. But at some point it was information that they accepted as or were told was true, and it sort of guided their decision to participate or not. I mean, I corrected it, but that's like 30 people in a sea of millions.
Yeah, I would say that, like, also going off of the question, like actually learning these processes does help to combat misinformation with examples like that. If you actually know how voting works, if you put a ballot in a tabulator that has races that were not voted for, and it spits it back at you and tells you to fill it in or just cast it with all of the other races that will be counted. If you do that, if you actually go work the polls or go to one of the training sessions provided to the public, then that will in turn kind of create a dampering of that misinformation. It changes your mind about things. There are people that think that elections can be hacked on the day of. If you become a poll worker and you learn that the voting machines are not connected to the internet, that kind of misinformation really, it gets downplayed. So things like that, just actually learning how the process works, definitely helps to combat misinformation, disinformation, and just kind of a lack of knowledge of how elections work.
Great. A couple more things in terms of, there's been a lot of questions about poll worker safety. And serving as a poll worker, have you felt safe doing so? And then for Richard, I would ask, in your training, do you teach how poll workers should deal with disruptions or basically conflict in the polls, and how they can de-escalate?
Actually, we kind of go over that in our site coordinator training. Of course, we use site coordinators here in the District of Columbia. Those are the persons that are in charge of the particular vote centers. Different jurisdictions call them different judges. We kind of cover that in our site coordinator training. In fact, most recently, I had a site coordinator training this past Saturday. And the Department of Homeland Security has given us a website that we can use to report any suspicious activity. If there is anyone that comes into the vote center that may look suspicious or brings a package in, they've given us a website that we can use, iwatch.dc.gov, that you can go in, anonymously put a tip in, and then they'll investigate the situation. But oftentimes we tell our election workers that if there is a voter that comes in that's disrupting the voting process, to grab someone that's in charge and maybe let them try to de-escalate the situation. We kind of give our site coordinators some tips and things to do in real life scenarios, and we use some war stories from prior elections in training as well to kind of help them if anything should arise in the vote centers.
Well, I will say that to everyone who serves as a poll worker, the number one thing that you need to do is to ensure that your safety is taken care of. And we on the EAC have several items on mental health and how to deal with a lot of the different issues of serving as a poll worker as well. So
I will say that I think, at least in my experience, the that would be the one area that I think I haven't gotten as much training as I would have liked. And I feel like often we have in the Durham area, we haven't had any bad poll things happen. And actually I'm in Orange County, not actually in Durham, but in this whole triangle, we really haven't had any bad stuff happen. And I feel a little bit like they just keep thinking nothing bad is going to happen. And I don't feel like it's as proactive as I would like it. And I think there are small things like, we wear name tags and stuff. And, I do wonder about that. I wear my name tag, but I do wonder whether it's really necessary to have my name there and whether I could just wear an official badge about, that I'm a poll worker. And, just there are ways that small and larger that I think poll workers could be a little more protected than they are. I think many of us are a little bit, have some trepidation about the upcoming election in November and feeling like that's likely to be worse than anything we've seen. The last general elections that I worked, it is unsettling when there are, big trucks. In North Carolina, there are going to be trucks driving by with big banners and stuff right in front of the polling place. And while it fits the law, it does feel like it could be, to me, like it could be intimidating to voters. It's intimidating to me. And I guess I'm not sure that in places that are not where the big problems have been, that folks are really paying as much of attention to this. I don't know what other folks think. Leah, what do you think?
I would say that I have faced a little bit more of that pushback and kind of intimidation working for the State Board of Elections rather than working as a poll worker. We've gotten a lot of calls of angry constituents who want to let out all of their wrath onto just people who work for the State Board of Elections. So I think that is a little bit more top of mind for me than actually being at the polls, because I think that people that come to the polls kind of want to show who they're voting for, want to express themselves, but get really dissatisfied with the aftermath of elections. So that process, I think, or that kind of mentality, I think, comes a little bit later for people, at least in my experience, than outwardly, disrespecting poll workers or something like that. But I would agree with Laura that I think that training on how to handle tense or intimidating situations should definitely be more emphasized in election judge and election worker training, as it seems to be a growing issue.
And I worry more, about guns. Over the 16 years, whatever that I've been doing this, there was just so many more guns around than there used to be. And when I ask about, what do we do about that? But basically, you're not going to know if a gun is brought in until, and yes, they're not supposed to bring guns in, and that's against the law. But, we don't get any special training about, what to do if that happens. And I don't know, at some point, should we have metal detectors before people come in?
Well, these are all good thoughts to keep in mind as we move forward, because, here we are in 24, and there will be an election for federal offices in 26, and there will be another one in 28 because elections continue on. I want to go to one other question before closing it out. There's 2 other questions left. And it goes towards what we saw in 2020, where we had an influx of people who were serving as poll workers, but we also had a number of companies and organizations who would grant their employees leave to serve as poll workers. And I think that for the most part, we've gotten away from that. So if the people who are on the panel today, or people who are watching this, can go back to their respective, organizations and ask for additional administrative leave, that would be great. Because we have a question, I can take 2 hours of administrative leave and the rest that requires annual leave. This is a huge disincentive for serving as a poll worker. I've served for over 20 years as a chief judge, and I started after the hanging Chad fiasco in 2000. So just my statement of, trying to get more people involved, and how can we do that? And it's mostly about ensuring that people have time off. It's hard enough getting people to the polls, but we need to try to find a way to get more people involved in the process overall. But if anyone has any other suggestions to that or other thoughts, we can open it up. If not, I can go to the last sort of closeout question.
Yeah, I know that Illinois has a specific provision in our election code that employees may notify employers that they will be election judges. Any employer that has over 25 employees has to provide for that kind of leave. So I think that if people in other states are wanting that to happen, maybe sending a letter to your representative asking them if that's a possibility to change the statute to allow that, because I know a lot of employers are probably not going to be willing to do that without some sort of, state mandate. Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. Anyone else? Well, I would say that, this has been really helpful, but what is a helpful or encouraging message that you would like to share with the people who are considering volunteering as a poll worker?
Well, I mean, I think I already said it's very satisfying work. And it's you have a sense of contributing to your community, and interacting and contributing to your community with a team, as a team. And then the educational parts of it and stuff. I mean, I would not hesitate to encourage anybody who thinks they might be interested to do it. I really enjoy it. I work lots of other things around in my life to be able to make sure that I'm available for all the elections, including a primary we have coming up in North Carolina that will probably get some ridiculously small amount of people at. But it is part of our democracy, and being able to be part of it in a constructive way, even during times when there's so much division, because you don't really see that so much at the polls. It's more people working together. It's just an extremely satisfying opportunity.
I'd also add that it's not that a 17-hour workday is easy, but working the polls is a pretty easy way, relatively, to gain a lot of insight into an aspect of your life that you maybe spend 5 minutes a year thinking about. So it's a lot easier than, reading statutes upon statutes of election code to try to understand things, or having hours-long conversations with people around you about what's true and what's not about elections. But just working one day and seeing everything happen can really provide a huge insight into that, and an important insight into civic engagement.
Yeah, I would also say that when election workers come to training classes, we educate them on the process. And most times, some of them have no idea about the process. So we're always looking for election workers. And in the District of Columbia, once you're an election worker, you may have the opportunity to work in another part of the city that you've not been to, or work in a neighborhood that you've not been to. So in working in different neighborhoods and working in different areas, you meet different people that you wouldn't normally work with or see in the course of a day. And it can be a very fulfilling opportunity, very fulfilling experience. It's about team building. It is a long day, and we certainly want to encourage those that have never volunteered just to give it a try and see what the process is like. There's a lot that goes into an election, and coming to training and actually working that long day and watching the results at the end of the night, it is a very fulfilling opportunity for most people.
Dr. King, were you going to say something?
Yeah, but I forgot how to unmute myself for a second. I was just going to say, one, I want to thank those of you who have taken time out of your schedules year after year to serve as a poll worker. As Leah mentioned, the days are long, and in most instances, the compensation isn't the best, but other added benefits. I don't know, I guess like when I think about poll workers, I just think like without them, we don't have elections, and without elections, we don't necessarily have democracy, right? And so poll workers, as all the panelists have mentioned, play a pivotal role in ensuring that the youngest eligible voter to the oldest eligible voter have an opportunity to participate and contribute to electoral processes that in turn impact how all of us interact with and experience American life. So.
Well, I want to thank you all for that. Richard, do you want to say something else, or were you just off?
No, I was just going to say that we rely heavily on the support of those persons, on the volunteers that serve as election workers, to join us as a part of the team. And that's one of the reasons that we oftentimes have a very successful election in the DC, because we could not pull the election off without their support and without them volunteering year after year with us. So we are eternally grateful to those that come back and volunteer with us year after year.
I would highly encourage those who are watching this to serve as poll workers, but also to go what Laura was saying of basically what I took from that was everyone, we get enough poll workers for the presidential, but also serve in the primaries as well, in other elections, and look to serve in any and all elections as a poll worker. Everyone wants to participate in the Super Bowl, but no one wants to be in the preseason. So we need everyone to do a part of this. So with that, I will turn this back over to Miles to close us out. And I want to thank you all for being a part of this. Miles?
Hey, thank you so much, Tom and Commissioner Hicks and all of our panelists here today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Just a few wrap-up notes here. We are recording the event today, so it will be available fairly soon thereafter, as well as we are collecting materials that have been shared with us from the audience, as well as our panelists today, and we'll distribute those. Additionally, be on the lookout for another event in June and July from the Elections Working Group on other election administration workforce related topics. June's event is likely going to be a collaboration with the Technology Standing Panel at the Academy, so we're looking forward to that. And then once again, please check out the Academy's Comparative Elections Report that just dropped last month. We are very, very proud of it, and look forward to hearing all of your feedback. And thank you once again for being here today.